One of the things I've become really interested in is kind of the Republican soul searching in the wake of the last election, in particular around the idea of climate change. And in fact, there's a op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Ryan Costello last week called Lessons from 2008, Republicans Must Deal with Climate Change. And I mean, I don't think this particular
2008 or 2018?
2018.
I always do that, by the way, too. I don't know why, but I always confuse 2002 and 2012. And I'll often say, oh, yeah, back in 2002 when I debated Bill McKibben. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And I mean, the basic view, and I think it's much more widespread than Costello, is the sense that like Republicans view themselves as being successfully painted as science deniers versus believers in climate change, and that that's politically poison. And so the search is, well, what is a kind of winning agenda for us on climate? And what Costello and other Republicans, who I think are the most outspoken on this issue, have latched onto is, well, we're going to say, yes, climate change is a problem, and we're going to latch on to some variant of the carbon tax. And their basic argument is, look, a carbon tax is a market solution. And if we pair it with tax and regulatory reforms and protect fossil fuel companies from some of these potentially devastating lawsuits, then like, let's call that a win for our ability to get energy, our ability to have a good tax structure, and then our ability to win elections because we're no longer deniers and delayers. And I mean, my reaction to this is that, first of all, this way of thinking about the carbon tax, I mean, a carbon tax is an authoritarian restriction on energy, if there ever was one. It says...
So what, just to jump in, so just so everyone's clear on the same page, what is a quote unquote carbon tax or carbon dioxide tax? Or what range of things can that refer to?
Well, yeah, maybe you or Stefan want to elaborate on this, but I mean, the basic idea is that for a given level of CO2 emissions, you're going to be taxed on that. And I mean, I think the proposals vary in terms of who explicitly bears that tax. I mean, it's generally going to be targeted at things like fossil fuel companies. And then economists can debate whether that tax gets passed on to consumers or... I mean, the real goal, or at least the theoretical goal that they hold out, is that, well, look, we're going to tax CO2 energy, and therefore people are going to embrace non-CO2 energy.
Right. So I mean, people are being, I mean, basically it's saying for people who use the mainstream or normal form of energy, you're going to have to pay a certain amount per unit of energy. And it's often put in terms of tons, which is when people are doing bad things, they'll often just use terminology or measurements that nobody has any reference to. They'll say, like, $20 a ton. And in the past, I don't have it off the top of my head, but translating this into dollars per gallon can be useful. But often there's a revealing range of these things, because sometimes people will say the equivalent of 10 cents a gallon. And then recently you've seen some reports where people will talk about something like $1,000 a gallon. And that's the thing. And often there's this bait and switch where people say, oh yeah, it's only 10 or 20 cents a gallon. And then, but to have real teeth, it's going to have to be $10 a gallon or something like that. So it's ultimately increasing the price that people pay for carbon-based energy, which is fossil fuel. So I interrupted a little bit, but go ahead with what you were thinking about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole idea is that the government is going to declare that a certain form of energy is one you shouldn't use, and therefore we're going to penalize anybody who does use it. And so this is their supposed market-based solution. And then, once you add the fact that their tax and regulatory reforms are politically infeasible, like the idea that that we've decided that the government should stop us from using fossil fuels, and that we'll therefore be able to roll back regulations on fossil fuel companies. I mean, that's just a non-starter for the Greens. And so what you're really going to end up with is then political support for a carbon tax, which on top of it will not do anything to meaningfully impact climate, because of course this tax only applies in the United States, which is going to be swamped in terms of CO2 emissions by China and India. But I think the most important point, though, is that I totally agree that Republicans need a better climate agenda. And it starts with recognizing that this false alternative between being a denier or a believer in climate change comes from this sloppy framework where we're asking, like, do you believe in climate change? versus I think the right focus is on we're for human flourishing, including climate livability. And then you need a policy agenda that allows us to achieve that, which I think includes energy abundance. And if you think that CO2 is a genuine problem, then the number one thing you would be for is decriminalizing nuclear. But it's all from the perspective of what allows human beings to flourish, and as a crucial component, what allows us to have access to energy.
Yeah. So if the Republicans, if they are at all the party of freedom, then in consequence, they should be the party of progress. And progress means progress in human flourishing. And there's this real potential to reframe every argument in favor of freedom and flourishing. But as long as they let the anti-freedom side frame the argument, which in the context of economic issues, unfortunately, the Democratic Party is very often anti-freedom, then you just see the spectacle of people who are in favor of freedom and who are thus in favor of more flourishing and more progress be on the defensive and be apologetic and think, okay, we gotta say something, and what is it, and just have no originality. So we talked last week about the issue of arguing to 100, I think we did, which is defining an inspiring goal, and then also defining what you believe is the evil thing, and then arguing that your product or policy or technology is the best way to get to the inspiring goal. So what I hope any Republicans listening to this just think about, okay, how can we reframe this, and how, which is really properly seen as a form of how can we do the right thing and then explain why it's right to people. So hopefully this idea of, okay, define your ultimate goal, that should be maximum human flourishing. And then part of that is going to be climate livability. And the biggest thing for climate livability is climate mastery, is human beings empowered to take the naturally dangerous climate and make it safe. And once you start thinking in those terms, then you can really take the high ground. And then you can also expose that the way people are thinking about finding superior alternatives to fossil fuels is completely contaminated by this green perspective, because as you mentioned, they're criminalizing the most promising alternative, which is nuclear. So really, and I've told Republican congressmen this, and I hope that people listen and take advantage of this. If you only just reframed the discussion around decriminalizing nuclear as your number one energy and climate priority, or at least your number one quote unquote climate related priority, or CO2 related priority, I should say, if you just focused on that, you could take the high ground and you could really expose the other side as anti-technology.